I'm a psychologist, and I have been working in the domain of leadership and leadership development now for a long time. In the first sort of 15 years of my career, in fact, when I was based in Toronto, I had a firm there, and we did a lot of leadership development, management consulting, working with Fortune 100 companies. And that took me to Paris, actually, and I moved to France. I was sort of strung out between the two for a while, between Toronto and Paris, working with the European side of the business. And when I was doing that, and this was in the late 90s, I was very aware that, well, first of all, there were very few women in leadership positions at that time in executive teams. And I was usually working in the late 90s, especially with executive teams. Big companies were in the process of transitioning from how do they shift from being this big behemoth organization to being more nimble. Microsoft was just starting to come in, some of these smaller niche players, and they had to be more flexible, and the old models of organizations just weren't working. And I sort of believed that the women that were of the few women that were in positions of leadership would be so happy to see me as the consultant, because there weren't that many women consultants either in those times, mostly men in that domain. And actually I found they were the most resistant to what I was bringing. The way of leading I was suggesting could be helpful, to be more collaborative, to take down the silos, to use what I now would understand to be some of our masculine capacities. So that was quite shocking to me. And then I would see them in the bar at the end of the retreat, in the evening, and they would talk to me and tell me what was really going on. And I would realize they were really suffering in many ways, and also had profound insights about the organization. I would say, well, bring this into the executive session tomorrow morning, that we need this input. And the next day would come, and they'd be back in their armored one of the boys' suits. And there's something, with a bunch of other factors was sort of going on at the same time, and I realized something's wrong with this picture. How is it that we, after so many years, it's taken us a long time to get in these positions of influence? How is it that we're there and we're actually entrenched inside what I thought at that time, and now I understand for sure, was an outdated model of leadership based much more on the military model of leadership, or a masculine model of leadership. So that set me off on a journey. Actually, I left my firm. I opened a private practice in Paris where I was working one-on-one coaching women executives. And I very quickly saw that I was somewhere that I thought I'm in territory here that I need more understanding about. That it became quickly clear that the issue wasn't going to be just about new behaviors that they had to learn, how do you be a better leader today, but that actually we were going to have, this had more to do with what I now understand as development. In other words, women needed to develop more capacity. We had sort of become stalled, as I'll talk about, inside a masculine model of leadership. So at about that time, I moved to the United States with my then husband. He was launching a company, and we came out here. And that gave me time to go back to graduate school in developmental psychology. Specifically, my focus was in women's development. And when I got into the field, I thought, okay, somebody's done this research. I'm going to go read the books, and I'm going to figure out how women develop, and I'm going to, then I'll come back and teach it. And there was only one real researcher, and her name is Carol Gilligan, a colleague of mine at Harvard now. And she had started to question the studies about human development, saying, is it true that men and women develop in the same way? Maybe not. Let's look through a developmental lens at how women unfold over time. So the long story short is to say that after I got my graduate degree, I began to run my own programs, and I embedded them in universities from the very beginning, so that the work I was doing would be legitimate research, and it wouldn't be somewhere where they're like the women's leadership ghetto, which at that time, which was 15 years ago, was just starting to develop. In fact, we were the only women's leadership program being run through a university at the time. So what I want to share with you is what came out of the research and where I am working now. And I hope those of you that are here now with me and those that will listen to this later, that you may also recognize what I'm talking about, because I've been doing a lot of talking since our book came out 2 years ago, and online classes and so on. And a lot of women are really excited and resonate with what we've actually seen emerging. So I want to, so that's my plan. That's where I'm going to, what I'm going to do with you here for the next 30 minutes. I'm going to share some slides with you while I do it. And the reason I mostly do slides is because they're mostly images. And one of the things I've come to understand about how we can, how we learn, how we take in information is much more than the left brain, the analytical brain. So I'm going to really encourage you to let these images speak to you as much as whatever, however my words may land. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and we'll track along here. All right, so you should all be able to see. Let me know if you can. Maybe just someone can put up your hand. You're seeing my book and The Way of the Mysterial Woman? Okay, good. All right. That is our book that came out 2 years ago, actually, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment. And I'll also explain where that word mysterial came from. So here's the first image I want you to take in. I believe we are literally at the end of an era. This is true for men and for women, by the way. I do believe, and I'm going to make a case for that in a moment. I will say that although my research the last 15 years has been with women, so that's women's development, I understand. A lot of what I've heard from working with men as well is that they recognize a lot of the same patterns. So we're really talking, as we go forward here, about the feminine and the masculine, as we're going to get into that, in men and in women. But we could say that, and if you let this image in fact, let me just ask the question, because I can unmute you if you'll play with me a little bit. What comes to you when you see that image? Like, what are the elements in this picture that stand out to you? Just put your hand up if you want, and I'll unmute you. Sabina, go ahead.
So to me, it's like a new beginning, the sunrise, and an end is always symbolizes a new beginning. So,
right. Okay, great. Thank you. So it could be a new beginning, something coming, but also there's something ending. Yeah. Anybody else? I can't actually see all the hands, so yeah, Caroline, I think.
Well, actually, I see the cliff. Like she's alone, just at the edge of the cliff. So,
and what does that say to you?
Well, sometimes you need to jump.
Yeah, well, and also just the feeling as you let it in. And it's interesting, I think we all tune in to this picture differently because images hit us differently, right? So what's hitting you is whoa, I'm at the edge here, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you. And that can be also anxiety producing. The maps we've had up until now are coming to an end. And it's true, there's no obvious bridge from here to there. And what we can sort of see the future, but not, it's in the mist. There's the excitement for some that, wow, this is all unknown, and I'm certain we're going to go there. And for others, or maybe a bit of both, it's like, whoa, where are we going? If that old model's over, what's the new model? So I think this is where we are. We're literally at the end of an era. And I want to show you how that actually looks on a map. And this is, I go into more detail in the book, and there are others that lay this out in their own language. But I just want to introduce this to you now so you can situate where we are inside a larger evolutionary unfolding. So you look at the vertical grid here, and it's consciousness so the awakening of consciousness. More complex, more consciousness means more complexity. More complex consciousness means more capacity. You know, obviously, when you're a baby or a youngster, you have a certain kind of consciousness. The brain is developed in a certain way. You can see a certain thing. As you get more complex, you then have more choices. You can do things. You can now walk. You can, you know, advocate for yourself, so on. So that's also true in culture. And then the horizontal grid we're going to think of as time. We're going back to 50, 60,000 years ago to the beginning here. And what I'm going to show you is not new. I mean, anyone who's studied history or evolutionaries will say there have been these 6 waves of consciousness for sure, and we're just heading into the 7th wave now. And every time a new wave comes in, there's a new worldview. That's a new way of making meaning. It's a new perspective. There's a new economic model, and there's a new leadership paradigm with each one of the waves. So let's look at how I see this, because we put this in terms of feminine and masculine. So we would say the first 50,000 years has been a feminine epoch. The first 2 waves, the archaic and the tribal waves, were much more clan-based, much more earth-centered. Everybody was stay in this great loving clan. We could call those all gathering around the archetype even of the Great Mother. And that's what the energy was at that time. Now, the way evolution works is basically when we create a kind of environment that comes out of the consciousness we have, we create problems that consciousness can't solve, as we'll see again in a moment. So this is what happens. Well, this became very suffocating. So then we have the masculine waves come in, and they come in, boom, one after the other. The warrior, the traditional, and the modern wave all come in, starting about 3000 BCE. And they come in to break up the stagnancy of that great mother, let's say. And the leadership paradigm changes with every one of these waves. We go from the emperor to the monarch to the executive. And in each stage and phase, we have more consciousness, we have more complexity, we have more capacities. So I would say, this is evolution's move forward. This wasn't a mistake that we had 5,000 years of masculine epoch, but it is really something to understand right now as we are coming to the denouement of that long cycle of time, yeah? So we would say, I say, that in around the 60s, we had the second feminine epoch come in. This more dynamic feminine. It wasn't like the first one, which was much more static, that static feminine. This was a very dynamic feminine. And it brought with it the postmodern wave. It was the breaking up, it was the sexual revolution, it was rights, equal race relations, it was back to the earth, it was the hippie movement, it was drugs, rock and roll, the whole thing. It was basically pushing against the 5,000 years of the patriarchy, right? Kind of the shattering of all of that, the breaking up of it all. But that was never meant to be the end game. That was evolution's move forward. Now where we are is right here. We're right at the beginning of the 7th wave coming in. And a lot of futurists would agree that's the wave that's on its way. It's certainly not the mainstream of culture yet, globally, but it is on its way. And it always starts, and when a wave is transitioning, as we're transitioning from postmodern to integral, it's always chaotic and confusing, and things fall apart and things are coming together. There are various shadow emerges from the historical waves that have come before. A lot of what we're experiencing now globally would be consistent with this transition from one wave to the next. And what we do know, that is, this new wave that's coming in is going to be more complex. It's going to require an awakening of consciousness that takes in more than it has before. And we are going to need both the feminine and the masculine now. That's just simply, it's not like we have to, we're launching a women's movement. It's something that evolution requires the feminine capacities to come online now in a way they never have before. So it's not about going back to something. It's a matter of actually engaging in a way we never have before, the fullness of the feminine inside ourselves and the healthy masculine for a union that has never existed before. And this is true in men and in women. So how do we know this is happening? Well, one of the things we know, again, through at the individual level, is the signs of emergence. There are two things that kind of happen concurrently. And they tend to be, it's very uncomfortable. The old shoe just does not fit anymore. I love this image because it speaks to something pressing out through the old, and in integral language we call it transcend and include. You know, we got here, we're emerging beyond that form, and naturally it's uncomfortable. We've come as far as we can inside that form. So the suffering is really important to notice, and the longing for a new way of being. This is what we've found in the last 15 years, and certainly women that find their way into our programs, but also I've been doing a lot of talks around the world, and what's pretty consistent is if I ask, you know, women, and I speak a lot to women's leadership audiences, you know, how's it feeling out there right now? And if I, unfortunately, so many of you have your cameras off, but I suspect if I asked you all, you know, how's it feeling? And are you noticing the press of an outdated, what I call operating system? You know, you might put up your hands, you know, if you recognize that, right? Like we're up against the end of an old system, but the new one hasn't come online yet. And one of the things that I hope my book is really doing, and it seems like it is normalizing this experience rather than giving you a feeling of I've regressed. How is it possible that I could get where I am now in my life and be feeling these things? Something's wrong with me. That actually these are the signs of emergence if we know we're actually in the process of giving birth to the next level of ourselves. And that's really key. I know in North America, we are at the highest level. I mean, it's shocking. Level of antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds right now for women. And in my understanding, my belief, and it's not that there's not a place for those kinds of aids in our human journey, but I do know that it's also been that we don't know how to make sense of what's going on, and so we either want to dial it down, which is, you know, get us on something that cools it all down, or we're already so down and feeling hopeless that we're trying to dial it up again. So it's a very confusing time. So at the same time as that discomfort's happening, there's also this longing. And if I asked you all to, again, a show of energetic hands at the least, since I can't see most of you, but I mean, a longing, like this seed growing inside of us. And I've spoken to hundreds of women, thousands of women at this point. Something's happening, you know, like you can kind of feel it, taste it, like that image we looked at the beginning. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I believe there's a possible new way of being, only I don't know what it is. And I'm not sure, you know, I dare to do it. So that's telling me and us, I would hope, that we need to turn on the developmental tap again. That's different than I need to feel better, I need to fix myself, I need to fix you. It's actually saying we're trying to grow, you know, just like when we went from, you know, we were babies and we were crawling, learning to walk. We have seen our wholeness inside a masculine model of wholeness. So we've kind of felt we've reached the end of the road there. But what if that's not true? What if actually we are developing like this beautiful nautilus, which is a wider and deeper, you know, channel? We actually have to grow again into ways of being we have never seen before in culture. So there are going to be a lot of models out there for this. Einstein himself was a developmentalist. I love this quote, we all know it. But this is a developmental move. He's basically saying exactly that. We can't solve the problems of today with that consciousness that created them. That's not the same as I need a new idea, I need some new behaviors. We're actually talking about consciousness, how we make meaning. When we were getting ready to publish the book and we had our own findings, we did a pretty comprehensive study of or survey of other leadership programs and other leadership surveys that had been done that were tracking what were the main leadership capacities that were going to be needed for future leaders. And we came up with this list that matched our own data as well. That basically, here are the 6 main qualities that are going to be needed, or capacities for leading in this next phase. Adaptability, creativity, ease with ambiguity and uncertainty, network thinking, building strategic alliance, and sensing what is critical and unspoken. And none of these are simple, right? They're not like a simple behavioral thing. They're all a kind of consciousness. Adaptability isn't just something you can go out and get an online course to figure out how to do, or an app, right? Creativity, not. They're complex ways of being. So that tells us, all right, how do we get these capacities? Well, that became pretty clear to us, and we're using a computer metaphor here, that we needed an upgrade in our operating system, literally a shift in the inner infrastructure, or how we make meaning. We have to turn on the developmental tap again, as I've said. So 2 things that became clear right away to us. One was we were going to have to figure out how women develop. And as I mentioned before, that meant working with hundreds of students in our programs and tapping into, well, how did we develop? And then so that we can understand the developmental cycle for women, and then how do we or might we encourage the next level of development if we're saying we're at a developmental nexus point. And I'll go into more about that in a moment, what we discovered. And the other thing was pretty clear early on, that we were going to have to understand something about the feminine and the masculine and how they go together. What is this thing? It's like global feminine, global masculine. What really are those essences inside ourselves, and how do we come to relate to them? How do we understand them? So in about 2010, in our research, and our first program was in 2000, so that was after 10 years of women that had been through our depth programs, level 1, level 2, we began to see a new pattern emerge. Something was happening, like ways of being that really were profoundly different. And we noticed that they had this ability to be with ambiguity, to be with the uncertain, as I was showing you on the earlier list, to be with what we call the mystery. To be, not just like be with it, like I can tolerate this, but actually to create the conditions for not knowing. In other words, not knowing as a condition for innovation, right? Partnering with the not knowing. And then the other capacity we saw was something called medial. And medial is a word that Carl Jung, psychoanalyst of the turn of the century, last century, his creative muse, Tony Wolff, came up with. And the word medial basically means how you are able to bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, between differences, hold many perspectives. And then the other meaning of the word is being able to hold a kind of middle ground, stay centered in the midst of chaos. And one day this word mysterial just appeared. So Stefan, you were asking how the word mysterial come to be. I'm describing it. So the word, because we couldn't find a word to describe what we were seeing. We were saying, oh, these are full presence leaders, they're integral leaders, and all of those felt way too dry. So the word mysterial, interestingly, a lot of people say to me, I think I know that word. How do I know that word? And then, and when we actually came up with it, I remember when it kind of popped out of my mouth, I thought, am I allowed to invent a word? Is that possible? And then we realized that, well, if we're really saying that what we're seeing is this pattern that's never been seen before on the edge of evolution, why would there be a word to describe it? So I felt full license to name it. All right, so then here at a high level, and I'm not going to go into all of this, this is complex, but the book, of course, goes into it all. What we found after 10 years of research was a developmental code, basically. There are these times in our life cycle, as from girls, from when we're born up through our elder years, where certain codes, almost like a genetic code, turns on, either feminine or masculine. And so understanding what those were became really important. We found that there was an active and a passive form of the feminine, and an active and a passive form of the masculine. Now that was really important because it helps us be much more precise in understanding how these essences move in us. And then we found that there were archetypes that aligned with each one of these feminine or masculine essences that we could use. They just kind of appeared for us because where we were going to be working was going to be with the unconscious, what we didn't know yet. Therefore, archetypes are very helpful in that way because they're sort of a bridge, as probably most of you know. I see some heads nodding, between the conscious and the unconscious. So I'm going to just show you the first polarity. This was the other key thing we saw, was that you couldn't look at feminine and masculine separately. There's a lot of talk right now today about feminine leadership. And what concerns me a little bit about that is that I don't think we need just feminine leadership. And I don't think that the feminine impulse arises separately from the masculine. It never has. You know, we don't see that happening. And they co-arise, and we need to understand how they impact one another. So I want to show you the first polarity, just to give you a sense so that you can recognize, see if you recognize the patterns here for yourself, because the way I now work with women and the way that I recommend you work is actually to go through this sequence to unhook from some of the old codes that are installed at each one of these developmental junctions. Okay, so the first activation is this very static feminine, just like we saw in culture, right? That 50,000 years. And the archetype here is the mother. What we discovered was that when, especially after we'd done the deep work, there was a primary belief that was embodied, that women would have here, and this is, I am enough just as I am. Now, what happens when this quality lights up in us, and we have access to the healthy mother, you could say, is this is where we rest into the ground of our being. This is when we are, you know, we value ourselves. We know we rest into our own sufficiency. We don't have the imposter syndrome of I'm not enough in some way. We know how to extend empathic resonance to others. This is the place from which we can even see and encourage the development of another woman. She's not just the competitor. She's actually part of the great family. You know, I'm not afraid of her as much because I actually can rest into my own sufficiency here. This is where we know to take care of ourselves, to nourish ourselves, that we actually have a human body and we need to tend it, so that we're not just a driven machine. So this is a really key first archetype in the sequence. And when that really arises, there is this remarkable sense of radiant presence that women embody. But the limiting belief is what's encoded. So the old code from 5,000 years of hypermasculine paradigm is that I am not enough. And it shows up in two really dramatic ways in the shadows. So the shadow work, we could say what's unconscious. One is the devourer. So I've over-identified with this archetype, and I want to take everybody in and take care of absolutely everybody else and control everything. So that, because fundamentally I don't feel I'm enough unless I'm attached and stuck to you. Or the neglector is the passive end. I don't want anything of the mother archetype, and it doesn't matter. So very often we swing between these two. What I see a lot is women are very much the neglector with themselves and the devourer in their family or in their organizations or in their teams. So that's the first archetype. Let me just see if I can get you more visible. I can't see you all here, but yeah, I think I'll wait and do Q&A at the end. It's just going to be too hard with this particular setup here. So let's just go to the other end of this polarity so we can get this visible. So this is the other end of the first polarity is a second activation, and it's a masculine, an active masculine. So we've got the static feminine and the dynamic masculine. The hero is the archetype. When this is really full on, I'm empowered to do what is mine to do. And that is not everything, right? Kind of empowered action arises. This is the part when this is healthy in us, lights up for the first time around 8 to 10 years old, but it really comes online more fully when we are in the, heading off out of our, out of high school into university. We're starting to build our adult, bring ourselves into the world with agency. This is the agentic masculine. This is how we penetrate the world, how we set goals and we take steps and we draw boundaries and we have a no for the sake of our yes. And, that's a very fiery energy to it. But the shadow here is this limiting belief that we found after, again, working with hundreds of women in our programs. This was super consistent. I have to do to be of value. I have to do to be of value. That's the old code after 5,000 years of the masculine pattern. So this sense of, I'm yoked to the old way of being, and the old model of doing, and when it's the active shadow, it's the dominator. So now it's a little different than the shadows of the first archetype. This is very much the workaholic. I just keep pushing people and myself to the very end. There's a kind of drive and aggressiveness, the overcome, the power over. That's a part of that shadow. Or the passive end of it, which is the capitulator, which is like, I give up, forget it. I can't do it anymore. Or I won't do it, or someone else should do it, take care of it all. And again, we tend to swing between these two, right? So dominator at home, capitulator at work, capitulator at home, dominator at work. We can usually know both of those in ourselves. So you can feel into, again, how familiar these old codes are for you, how much of the new codes are starting to want to come online. But when the whole polarity is opened, and this takes, in our programs, we do the deep work, the shadow work for this to happen, then this is the operating system. I am enough just as I am and empowered to do what is mine to do. That's sustainable. That's a sustainable way of leading. From that arise all sorts of behaviors. But this is the operating system, right? The operating system itself has to run on a new code for women if we're going to be able to be the ones making a difference right now in our families, our organizations, and in culture. So that brings us to what are we doing? What do you need to do? Well, what we need to do here is heal the developmental trauma. And that is these early wounds that we could look at this inside the family of origin, and we can also look at it in terms of culture, and we can also look at it in terms of epigenetic, right? What's been passed down over time after 5,000 years. No matter how you look at it, the work we need to do is to be able to go toward the conditioned mind, the ways we made meaning, the ways we understood ourselves, and unhook from those old ways of being that we established to get love, safety, and belonging. They were not wrong at the time. They were the best solution we had, but they are now holding us hostage. So that means we have to recognize we have 3 vibrant centers of intelligence, and we're going to have to work in all of these. We're going to have to unhook from the beliefs that are mental. And we're going to have to open up the right brain as well as the left. Recently at a big global event, peace event, and could feel, there's an urgency, especially here in the United States, we can sense this pretty dramatically, to be making changes in culture. And therefore, we just want to get out there and get going. But in my view, it's not enough just to be a woman, another woman on a board, another woman in an executive position. If we don't bring a new consciousness, a new way of seeing, going, checking, being, then we're not bringing anything that different. We are still running the old code. And that's not really going to make that much of a difference, in my opinion. So here are my kind of summary thoughts here. But basically, the possibility that our discomfort right now is a sign of something bigger, of emergence itself. That we don't know how it'll go. We never do. And when we're in one of these transition times in culture, whenever those big waves of consciousness and culture are transitioning, it could be a renaissance, it could be a dark ages. It's actually unknown. We do know it will be shaped by those of us at the edge. And this we actually do know. And there's been enough research, and I write about it in the book, to show that always in the tipping points in culture, there are those who hang out at what I call the frothy edge of evolution. And their ability to maintain and hold and grow a positive image of a new future in the midst of challenge is a very significant factor in what actually can unfold. So this sense of, I suspect if you're all in Stefan's organization, in some way you all have a sense of this, like that we are needed and that we do make a difference, and we will absolutely need each other. So communities like yours and the communities I have become really important, because we are a bit of a new species coming forward here, and it's not necessarily going to be totally endorsed by culture. I'm going to just close with this quote, which I love, by Arundhati Roy. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. I think that is so beautifully speaks to the rising of the feminine simply as an evolutionary imperative. Whether or not we embody this in the sacred marriage with the masculine is really up to us. But that impulse is rising, I think we can be pretty sure of.